Christy is a licensed professional counselor at Resolve Counseling and Wellness. She views counseling as a collaborative process where the primary goal is to uncover your values that inform important life decisions. She is person-centered in her approach to counseling. She understands that every person's story and situation is unique and valid. She is intentional about developing trust and creating a judgment-free space. When working with couples, she uses a Gottman approach, which integrates empirical evidence on what makes love last. Based on 40 years of relationship research, the Gottman approach takes the guesswork out of how we can cultivate strong and lasting relationships. Christy is here to talk about mindful connections, embodying healthy interpersonal relationships.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me on a discussion about healthy relationships and embodying those interpersonal relationships that really bring meaning to our lives and health to our lives and really enrich our lives. So thank you, Holly, for that introduction. I think the one thing that I might add is the last 4 years I have really focused on what constitutes healthy relationships. I've gotten really curious about that academically and professionally, and also on what makes love last. And so that's kind of been my emphasis in graduate school and postgraduate studies and in trainings, and I'm really excited to share with you what I've learned in regards to that. You may hear me talk about a lot of this stuff, the tips and tools that I'm going to talk about regarding embodying those healthy interpersonal relationships in terms of the couples context, because that is primarily the work that I do at Resolve, as I see predominantly couples. But please know that even if I'm saying couples, it also, these tips and tricks, they definitely translate well with coworker relationships and family relationships and relationships with teens and tweens and parent-child and sibling relationships as well. And we're just pulling up my slides here, getting the slideshow started. Thank you. Okay. Oh, which key am I using? Sorry about this. Okay, so here's our agenda. First, I'd really like to identify those protective factors from developing vicarious trauma, which is extremely important with being in a helping profession living in a pandemic today. And you know, it's probably no surprise that healthy, supportive social supports and relationships is part of that. So kind of just laying the stage for embodying those healthy interpersonal relationships. And then as well, we're going to look at those common pitfalls that we helping professionals face with getting that professional support that we need. Then we're going to talk about the 7 primary emotional command systems that were found by the neuroscientist Jack Panksepp. They're very important in distinguishing how we sometimes get into conflict with people that are most important in our lives and understanding what's behind that conflict, decoding that conflict, since we'll get into that and break that down. And then the last few items, we're going to look at those tips and tricks, those tools that you can integrate into your relationships to get past some of those conflicts, and how to use your relationships to have stress-reducing conversations and bring more support and bring more satisfaction out of those relationships. So here's where we have our first code word. Like Holly was saying, you need this code word to redeem your continuing education credit. So if you are watching this for a CEU credit, please write down this first code word. It's dreams. The second code word is to come. It'll be later and I will pause at that time. So the first code word, please write down this word, dreams. So vicarious trauma, what is it? So it was originally defined and looked at through the lens of how it impacted psychotherapists. So those mental health professionals who are experiencing those similar adverse mental health outcomes as their clients after spending long time care and interactions with them in that therapeutic setting. So that term, that idea of vicarious trauma has actually been broadened now to a much larger scale of that it can impact pretty much anybody, to be honest, especially people that are in the healthcare professions. So those first responders, teachers, medical professionals, they can all be impacted by this. And so the broadened definition here is a large number of cruel and destructive disasters where the degree of damage exceeds the psychological and emotional tolerance and indirectly leads to various psychological abnormalities. So there's this idea that we have these stressors, these strains, this damage, this chaos in our lives that sort of outweighs those tolerance skills, the resiliency skills, the coping skills necessary to manage all that extra stress. So clearly we're under a lot of that stress, living in a pandemic in a really uncertain time, living in an election year, living in all the above. We've got all the stressors that we're facing right now on top of just living our normal lives. So it's really important to be aware of this in a time like this, and some of those symptoms when that happens, when we get out of balance in that frame, is loss of appetite, fatigue, physical decline, sleep disorder, irritability, inattention, numbness, fear, and despair. Sometimes it could even be accompanied with interpersonal conflicts and suicidal ideation. So especially something to keep in mind and to be really cognizant of when we're in a real uncertain time. So how do we protect ourselves? This is just a brief overview of some things of how we can protect ourselves. And Sydney Redding did a fantastic job on Wednesday talking about burnout and how to protect ourselves from burnout. And so a lot of the things that she covered in that presentation also apply here to protecting ourselves from vicarious trauma. And she has 12 really distinct, wonderful things that you can do. So if you're interested in learning even more about how to protect ourselves, I would really recommend you go back and watch that one from Wednesday if you haven't already. Probably the most interesting research that I have read this year about protecting ourselves from vicarious trauma was done in a study earlier this year in China, and they looked at 3 different groups. They looked at frontline medical professionals, so frontline meaning those medical professionals who were treating COVID-19 patients. They also looked at non-frontline medical professionals, and they looked at civilians. And the really interesting finding was that they found that those that were reporting more symptoms of vicarious trauma were the non-frontline medical professionals and the civilians. So definitely counterintuitive of what we might think would happen. So why is that? Why is it that the frontline medical professionals, those nurses and doctors who are directly treating the COVID-19 patients, are not experiencing as much vicarious trauma as the non-frontline and the civilians? And what they found, what the researchers believed what was happening, is 2 things. Those that voluntarily say, hey, I want to take care of COVID-19 patients, just by the fact that they're putting themselves in that position, are showing a level of resiliency and coping skills necessary to be that buffer against those trauma symptoms. Self-efficacy also is there along with resiliency, and that's also been shown to be a fantastic buffer and mitigator of traumatic stress. The other thing that I think we can all take away is that what they believed was happening is that these frontline medical professionals had accurate and up-to-date information regarding the pandemic. So they were closer to the current treatments, closer to the current understanding of what was going on with the virus, how it was transmitted, the risks involved and such. And so us having up-to-date, accurate information is very important to protect ourselves from vicarious trauma. So really go into those sources that you can trust: the WHO, the CDC, the National Institute of Infectious Illnesses. Go into those single sources and not consuming information that's sort of been regurgitated and shared around and coming from random websites or being reshared on Facebook, and just being really cognizant that confusion around the pandemic
can really increase our risk for vicarious trauma. And then these other ones are probably not going to be a surprise to you: exercise, eating healthy, adequate sleep. You know, when I see clients and they have anxiety and depression, one of my first questions is, how much are you sleeping? How many hours of sleep are you getting at night? Sleep can really protect us from that stress, from that traumatic stress. Something else that's really interesting that I found as far as keeping ourselves healthy is Dr. Dan Siegel. He's a psychologist, a therapist, and also an author of many wonderful parenting books. He's come up with this idea of the healthy mind platter. So it's a spin-off of the healthy food plate. So what is it that our mind needs a balance of to stay healthy? And he identified sleep time, physical time, focus time. So that focus time really meaning that time where we're getting professional, we're really focused in on work. Time in, so time to be introspective, time to reflect on ourselves and increase that awareness, whether it be awareness of our emotional states or our reoccurring thoughts or just how we feel in our bodies. Downtime, time to just not have anything on the schedule, just to sit and relax. Playtime, super important. Recreation, hobbies, time, you know, having fun, and connecting time. So again, that social support, that time where we are feeling less alone because we're with our friends and family. So we all need a little bit of each one of these things. And some things you'll find you might, as individualized, you'll need more of. And so just being cognizant that you're getting a mixture of all these things is also really helpful. And then finally, what we're going to focus on today is that social support, whether it be from our partners, our families, our friends, our coworkers, or from therapists if we need that. And that's the bulk of what we're going to talk about today. So lastly, as far as like setting the stage of why this is so important, I'm going to do a little bit of a research dump on you today and kind of set the stage of how loneliness and unhealthy relationships impacts our bodies and impacts our physical health. So the emphasis on differentiation of self from others in popular psychology today does not take into account the biological evidence regarding how loneliness and unhealthy relationships impacts our physical health. So interpersonal dependency on significant others is a basic need, and it's a biological fact. It's not a preference or a choice. So the following is sort of a list of evidence that speaks to that. So Louise Hockley for the Center of Cognitive and Social Neuroscience at the University of Chicago found that loneliness raises our blood pressure to the point where risk of heart attack and stroke is doubled. Louise Burbridge and James House of the University of Michigan found that unhappy marriages can increase our chances of getting sick by 35% and even shorten our lives up to 48 years. Whereas those who are happily in happy pair bonds live longer and healthier lives. Having a partner who supports our needs for attachment helps us remain emotionally and physically healthier, and we live longer. So kind of along the same lines. And this was talked about in the book Attached, the New Science of Adult Attachment by Amur Levine and Rachel Heller. So Dr. Kai Colt Glasser, a psychologist at the Ohio State University, was able to find out that our immune system and level of stress hormones are directly affected by the way we talk to our partners. In addition to that, John Gottman of the Gottman Institute found that he could measure the level of contempt in between a couple's conflict discussion and found that that level correlated very strongly to the amount of infectious illnesses both the speaker and the listener would experience in the coming year. So it has a true, the way we talk to each other has a big impact on our immune system function. And over long term, if that's suppressed, it really can open us up to chronic diseases that we might not otherwise have developed. So Dr. James Cohn, the director of Effective Neuroscience Laboratory at the University of Virginia, he found that couples who report high levels of satisfaction experience less distress and physical pain when accompanied and touched by their partner while undergoing difficult medical procedures. So this study demonstrates how intimate relationships can have the power to regulate psychological and emotional well-being. Just the mere physical proximity and emotional availability of a partner influences our stress response. Dr. Brooke Feeney, the director of Carnegie Mellon University Relationship Lab, found that positive interpersonal relationships impacts how we feel about ourselves to the degree in which we believe in ourselves and are able to pursue our dreams and goals. And we're going to talk about dreams and goals here in a minute as well. Dr. Baker, the psychiatrist at the University of Toronto, he indicates that once we are attached to a partner, they influence our heart rate, our breathing, our hormone levels in our blood, for better or for worse. And that correlates really strongly with marital satisfaction surveys. Again, House from the University of Michigan, he says that emotional isolation is more dangerous. It's a more dangerous health risk than smoking or high blood pressure. And both smoking and high blood pressure are commonly warned in our society to watch out for. And he states that suffering is a given, and suffering alone is intolerable. And the last couple ones here, Dr. Cohn, a psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania, when he looked at patients with congestive heart failure, he found that the state of their marriage is a strong predictor of survival after 4 years. You know, and these findings, they don't just, the physical and the socio-emotional impacts of interpersonal connections, they are not limited to adults. So John Gottman, again, from the Gottman Institute, in his research, he found that parents, those that consistently turned away from their children's emotional bids for connections, he found that those kids suffered long-term consequences, such as experiencing more frequent negative emotions, fewer positive ones, trouble developing the social skills necessary to make peer friendships, academic decline, and problems with physical health. So on the flip side, the good news is that when parents were emotion coaching, when they used emotion coaching strategies and they responded consistently to their children's emotional bids, they found that these children were more able to regulate various emotional states, that they were better at soothing themselves when upset. They could calm their heart rates. They had fewer infectious illnesses, in part because their ability to physiologically calm themselves. They were better at focusing their attention. They related better to others, even tough social situations in middle school involving teasing. They were more apt to read social cues and understand others. They reported better friendships with peers, and they performed better academically. So in a sense, these kids who were emotion coached and whose emotional bids were responded to, they sort of reported this higher IQ in terms of the world of feelings, emotional intelligence, and reading social interactions. And if you are curious to learn more about what emotion coaching is, there are 5 distinct steps on how to do that. I'm happy to meet with you and talk more about that, but you might be really interested in the book, How to Raise an Emotionally Intelligent Child by John Gottman. It's a lot more on that. The common pitfalls that we helping professionals face with getting the help we need when we get stuck in our interpersonal relationships and we're in conflict or they're just not as healthy as we would like them to be, sometimes we need that extra professional support. But we also have some common pitfalls. So as helping professionals, it's much more natural for us to be the helper. It's uncomfortable for us to ask for help. That's not a role that we might be comfortable in. So we might have feelings of guilt and shame for not having it all together. shoulding ourselves for knowing better. So we may have this training, we may have this experience, we may have this knowledge that we think we should know better. We should know how to figure this out. And the truth is that we're asking too much of ourselves when we should ourselves in that way. We're asking ourselves to be this objective person that we're not, to be able to sort of, if you will, psychoanalyze our relationships from a perspective that we can't. And one of the most wonderful analogies I've heard about therapeutic support is this idea of you're stuck in a jar and you need somebody to read the ingredients on the outside. It's just a matter of perspective that we don't have. And yet we get into these common pitfalls. We know that stigma about getting the help we need is bad and wrong, and yet we still experience it ourselves. So we might be thinking that we can handle it all without the professional support, or we just might be plain embarrassed for asking for help. So these are the common pitfalls that we all fall into for not getting that extra support to get kind of unstuck when we get stuck in needing, our relationships to be healthier. So let's talk a little bit more. So that I set the stage, I shared with you a bunch of scary research, and let's talk about what we can do to enhance our interpersonal relationships. So kind of the second part here second half here is discovering our unique values dreams that we can sort of get a lens and a glimpse through understanding our primary emotional command systems. We're going to understand how reoccurring conflicts that we have in those most important relationships oftentimes arise due to conflicting primary emotional command systems within the relationship. And you'll know what I'm talking about after I have a chance to explain what that is. And we're going to learn how to value our primary emotional command system while at the same time understanding and honoring the conflicting ones in our interpersonal relationships. And then we're going to go over how to employ a tool that's very successful with at least couples, and I think also in parent-child relationships. We're going to talk about the dreams within conflict, and we're also going to talk about the stress-reducing conversation, which is good for all types of relationships. So I love this caricature. I'm not going to spend a long time on it, but it just really makes me laugh because this is when we have these reoccurring conflicts, and when we have conflicts in general, a lot of times we're stuck trying to make the goal proving our angle. And what we found is this doesn't work, that we're going to just keep having the same argument over and over and over again. So we have to switch the goal. We have to make the goal to talk in a way that we are listened to listen in a way that we understand the other a bit more. And so really just switching the stage and the context for having those conversations. So here's the 7 emotional primary command systems. This was developed by Dr. Jack Panksepp. He was a neuroscientist and researcher, formerly a professor in the Department of Psychology at Bowling Green State University. He unfortunately passed away 3 years ago. So he discovered the 7 distinct emotional command systems present in each person's brain. Each command system correlates to an important survival function, such as rest, self-defense, and procreation. So these survival functions, they inform behavioral, physical, and emotional responses to everyday events. And this is what John Gottman has named these emotional command systems in his book with Joan DeClaire, The Relationship Cure. So he calls them Jester, which is responsible for play and fun, recreation. It's the part of us that makes life, interesting and enjoyable. The sensualist, so this is responsible for sexual gratification, procreation, attraction, lust. The nest builder, so this is sort of that motherly love, affiliation, friendship, care, and nurturing. Clearly super important for the survival of our species. Commander-in-chief, so this is characterized by dominance, control, and power. This is the person that just gets stuff done. The explorer, this is the person who's really curious about the world. So they love to search, they learn, they set goals, and they really are good at goal setting and such. The energy czar, so this is the part of us that's responsible for really caring about getting that rest, finding food, staying healthy, going to those those annual PCP visits and are responsible for our dental hygiene and such. And then we have the Sentry. So this is the system that's really trying to avoid danger. They're vigilant and defensive, and they're really kind of that person that wants to make sure everything's safe before they go and do and act. So all of us have a little of each of these 7 emotional command systems. And what I found, especially with couples, is that there's about 1 to 3 that are highly important and they score very high in. And so these ones that we score really high in come most natural to us. And if you are interested in taking a self-assessment on this without, buying the relationship cure, feel free to write down my email address, which will be on our last slide before the Q&A section. And I can just email you the self-assessment if you're curious on finding out what yours is and maybe what your partner's is. So kind of just to give an example of how this might come up in conflict in our important relationships, I got permission from my husband to talk a little bit about how it comes up for us. So I score very, very high in the jester. So I'm all about having fun and making every situation the most fun possible. Whereas he scores very high in the Sentry. So he's very concerned about keeping our family safe. So you can imagine when I proposed to him that I wanted to buy a scooter, what his response might have been to that. And so we sort of, our recurring conflicts often have to do in between, let's do this would be so much fun. And, he's going to say, wait, is this safe? Is everybody okay? Are we sure that this is not going to put us in any danger? And so this is a really wonderful lens into decoding why we keep having the same conflicts over and over again. And you can see this with coworkers, you can see this with parent-child relationships, you can see it in, sibling relationships, why we just kind of get stuck in conflict and are not meshing well in certain topics. And a lot of times it's because this is happening behind the scenes. So how do we get past that? How do we get past that conflict? So this is a really important stat. If you, again, are hoping to get some credits here, write this percentage down. So 69% of conflicts within couples, in the couples research that John Gottman did, he found are reoccurring and unsolvable. So that might, we can take that one of 2 ways. We can be like, oh crap, that's a really big number. I'm going to keep having this conflict over and over and over again with my partner. That does not sound exciting. Or we can take it as, wow, okay, so if I'm going to keep having this argument over and over again, how can I switch it up? How can I change the context here? How can I change the dialogue that's happening between us? And this is how we do it, through the dreams within conflict. So the dreams within conflict help us get past that perpetual gridlock conflict. And again, it's because there's a value and a dream and a really important emotional command system underneath 2 people's position on the topic, which is why they keep having it over and over and over again. So here we're going to switch the stage. We're going to make the goal to better understand each person's dream. We're going to take turns talking for 15 minutes. We're going to refrain from trying to prove an angle or persuade the other. And we're going to refrain from problem solving, at least at this time. So the bottom line is we want the kind of relationships that honor each other's differences, that support each other's dreams, relationships that help make life dreams come true. They are highly valuable to us and they embody breakable bonds. So a little bit more about the dreams within conflict. Here's sort of the dream speaker and the dream catcher guidelines. Please don't feel like you need to write all of this down. If writing is the way you learn, then please feel free to do that. But don't feel like you need to write all of this down. I have handouts for the dreams within conflict. Feel free to email me, write down my email address and ask me for this handout. I'm happy to provide that for you. But just as sort of like stepping back and an initial view of guidelines for the speaker versus guideline for the catcher, you'll notice that there are more guidelines for the listener, for the dream catcher, than there are for the speaker. And that's just kind of a statement of our society in general, we tend to not be very good listeners. And so it's a good reminder that it actually takes a lot of work to be a good listener. It's not just sitting there being quiet. So what is it? It's really creating that safe place for that listener to share their dream. It's really listening. It's postponing your agenda, postponing your reactions and thoughts. And sometimes with my couples, what's helpful is I'll give them a clipboard, and if they have a reaction or a thought or something that feels really important for them to say, they might take note of it so that they can come back to it later, but to still give the speaker their time to really explore their dream. Asking open-ended questions is a fantastic way to get that dream out from the other person. Of course, suspending judgment. And defensiveness is probably the most difficult, I'll call it pitfall for lack of amount of time here to explain what it is, but defensiveness is the most difficult pitfall that I find in couples therapy to change. And that's because our natural response to feeling sort of unjustly accused or attacked is to defend. But the problem with defensiveness is that it can stall out a really important conversation that can lead to intimacy and resolution. And so being able to turn your defensiveness into a question, an open-ended question to seek more understanding, is going to really help that dialogue continue. And again, postponing that problem solving and being interested, making eye contact, taking notes, really trying to get the essence of the speaker's dream. So, the listener isn't the only one that's working hard. The dream speaker, to be able to be listened to, really has got to honestly discuss their feelings, using those I statements, exploring what their position means to them, really understanding what it symbolizes and what values are underneath their position on the issue. There's a list of dreams that are provided in the handout by the Gottmans, and that's to follow. So if we're getting stuck on trying to unearth what that dream is, there's a list of common dreams that's about to come up. And really refraining from arguing our point of view. So again, getting out of that image that I shared earlier about, is it 6 or is it 9? Who's more right? So we're not trying to do that. We're not trying to prove our angle. We're really just trying to invite the listener in to hear our perspective, hear our dream, and hear our values behind it. So in that, we're going to avoid criticism, blaming, contempt, and use statements. Here's some wonderful dream catcher questions. The first 4 are probably the most important. As you can see, 8 and 9 here, they're really the problem-solving questions, which is why they're at the end. Again, don't feel like you need to write all this down. You can email me if this is something you're interested in having. Questions like, do you have any core beliefs, ethics, or values that are part of this position? Is there a story behind this for you? Sometimes the argument in a couple session about gift giving isn't so much about, somebody's more materialistic than the other. A lot of times there's a history, there's a story behind, maybe not getting a lot at holidays, maybe not getting a lot at your birthdays, and not feeling really seen or celebrated by, somebody's family of origin. And so getting those gifts as an adult from that important person in your life really speaks to something that was missing. And so a lot of times there's a story behind a perpetual gridlocked issue. And asking this question is one of my favorite things in couples therapy, because you just hear this beautiful story and it just opens up this vulnerability that sometimes people haven't heard before, and they didn't know that was going on for that person. And so it's gone from, man, I feel like my partner's being materialistic, to being like, oh my goodness, I had no idea. You just want to feel celebrated and loved. I'm happy to do that. Here's the sample dreams that the dream speaker can pick from if they're feeling stuck. A lot of times, what people pick from this list correlates with those primary emotional command systems really well. So, as a explorer might often pick travel, or, the nurturer might pick something like healing or closeness. The jester might pick adventure. So a lot of this really speaks to people's values and dreams and goals underneath, and this is a part of the handout as well. Here's where we have our second code word. So please, if you're doing this for continuing education credit, please take a moment to write down this word. So the first word was dreams. And the second word is conflict. Now we're going to get into our other tool, how to have a stress-reducing conversation. And this is one that's particularly useful in really all different types of relationships. Of course, couples relationships is really important, but this is a really helpful tool for coworkers, family relationships, and parent-child relationships. So the really important research finding with this tool is that couples therapy tends to have the same percentage of relapse as the medical model. So for instance, with those who have a diabetes diagnosis, often in active treatment care, managed care, are compliant, and then afterwards when they are responsible for maintaining that treatment, we see a 50% relapse. So a really big number, and couples therapy is the same. So, you know, that's a scary thing as a couple therapist to hear, like, what, 50% of my couples are gonna like stop doing the good work and all this progress that we, you know, spent all this time and money on doing. And so what's wonderful is that Neil Jacobson and John Gottman found that the couples that kept the progress, so the 50% that maintained the progress, retained that good work, did this. They did a stress reducing conversation. So it's immensely helpful to embody those healthy interpersonal relationships. It maintains friendship, it maintains conflict management skills, it maintains sexual intimacy. And, you know, and again, I know I'm talking a lot in the couples context, but this is also extremely helpful in other relationships. So the stress reducing conversation, it has the power of using the relationship as a buffer for outside stress. Yeah, how valuable is that? It's like it's like self-care, you know, using the relationship as self-care to outside stress. So it really helps individuals feel less alone, makes them feel more supported, and of course protects us from vicarious trauma. There are 5 agreements that the two people would be helpful to agree upon before engaging in the stress reducing conversation, which we're about to get into. And there are also a few speaker and listener guidelines to make it effective, just like the Dreams Within Conflict tool. So if we get stuck, I have personally added some sample questions to get the conversation going, because what I found with couples is when it was really important for me to say, hey, before you terminate, please let me teach you the stress reducing conversation so you can maintain all this progress. Well, sometimes they weren't feeling stressed. And so they're like, well, how do we have this conversation if we're not feeling stressed? And so I added some questions here on how to still have the conversation, even if somebody's not necessarily feeling very stressed at the time. So we can still practice it and use it even outside of stressful times. So here's the 5 agreements on making the stress reducing conversation effective. So we're going to agree on timing. So we're not going to assume that, you know, the best time for me is the best time for you. So say right as soon as I get home from work, I want to decompress the day. I want to get the stress off my back, but that may not be the best time for my husband. You know, maybe he needs 30 minutes to just take a break, to not see anybody, you know, maybe to go in the basement and have a moment alone. And so agreeing on timing is really important on making this effective. So don't assume that just because you're feeling stressed in the moment, the person that you're hoping to engage in this type of conversation with, don't assume that it's the best time for them either, and check with them first. Hey, is there a time that you have 20, 30 minutes to talk with me? So we're going to dedicate our presence for 20 to 30 minutes. So each person ideally gets at least 10 to 15 minutes to talk. So really try to pick a time where you can have uninterrupted, engaging time. This is really important. We're not going to discuss our relationship. So for the stress reducing conversation to work, it's not about problems within that particular relationship. We're not bringing up issues. This is the part that's very different from the dreams within conflict. This is not about the relationship. This is about making the relationship a buffer to outside stress. Agreement 4, all emotions are welcome. So frustration, anger, sadness, joy, celebration, flirtation, like everything's welcome. We're gonna let them all be there. And so if you find that some emotions are more easy for you to listen to or make space for than others, this is a really good time to explore that. And there's, explore why is it that maybe anger is, too hard for us to hear or make space for, or frustration or whatnot. There's a slew of wonderful therapists at Resolve that can help us explore why, we might have a hard time hearing some emotions than others. Agreement number 5, we're going to postpone problem solving and giving advice. And I'm going to speak a little bit more to why this is so important here in a minute. So again, just like the last tool, we've got guidelines for the speaker and guidelines for the listener. And again, I just want to take a moment to kind of step back and look at the fact that there are a lot more guidelines for the listener than there are for the speaker. Just re-emphasizing the fact that it takes a lot of work to be a good listener. So we're gonna start with the listener again, and don't feel like you need to write all this down. You can email me. I've got a blog up on Resolve's website that has this listed out already. So the listener is going to stay present and engaged. Eye contact is wonderful for giving that nonverbal communication that we are listening. Asking questions to understand, removing distractions, and really postponing your agenda. We're going to show compassion. So I think the hardest thing for at least the couples that I work with in this is 2 things: not problem solving, and the temptation, if you will, to take the other person's side. So sort of siding with the enemy, if you will. So if the conversation by chance is about stress about a boss, or stress about a difficult coworker, or stress about a difficult family member, the listener sometimes might feel the urge to say, well, maybe this is what your boss was thinking, or maybe this is how your family member felt, or maybe this is where your coworker was coming from. So they're essentially siding with the enemy. And the problem with that is when we're distressed, and we just need somebody for emotional support, the last thing we need is for somebody to side with the other person. We need just a moment to be supported. We need a moment to feel like we're safe to explore that. And I kid you not, so many times when somebody is given the opportunity to sort of have that space to get through this frustration, they go, and then they're not met with siding with the enemy, but they're met with, you make sense, or that sounds really hard, or I can see how that is difficult from your perspective. It's so interesting how many times then the speaker then goes, they take a deep breath, and then they say, I guess maybe my boss could have been thinking this, or maybe this is where that coworker, and they're on their own. They get there on their own. And if we could just wait for a minute to give that space, the speaker tends to get there anyway. So it's so important not to side with the enemy and just allow that time for people to emote. So in that, with showing compassion, that's how we're going to do that. We're going to show that emotional support. We're going to offer that non-judgmental space, and we are not going to side with the enemy. So again, and here's speaking to the problem solving part, we're not going to offer unsolicited solutions. So we're going to, only when the person who's speaking feels fully understood will they be really receptive to suggestions. That tends to be how it goes, is until they feel like they've totally been able to say how they're feeling and they feel like they're understood and empathized with, then they may be open to some of those problem solving helpful tips and suggestions. Being affectionate when appropriate. Clearly touch is most not likely not appropriate for a coworker relationship, but in a romantic relationship, you know, another way to be supportive is, you know, maybe touching them in some affectionate way. If you don't know what to say to offer that validation or understanding, I have a list here of things that might be helpful. So you make sense can sometimes be the most powerful thing somebody can hear. I make sense, you know, I'm not going mad here. My emotions are valid. I'm a legitimate person here experiencing a legitimate feeling. Something like that sounds awful. That sounds terrible, or that sucks. I can see why you would feel that way. I would be stressed out too. That would hurt my feelings too. I'm here for you. I can see how that would be stressful and that must be hard, are all ways to offer that empathy and support. So guidelines for the speaker, you know, not talking more than the 10 to 15 minutes, making sure to switch that role and offer that for the listeners as well. Again, not talking about the relationship, complaining, but again, not about your partner. So it's in there twice because it's really important for this stress reducing conversation to work that we're not complaining about the relationship. And if you don't know what to say, sifting is a wonderful Dr. Dan Siegel exercise. So going through sensations, images, feelings, and thoughts. These are some of the sample questions. Don't feel like if you want to write them down, you can, but feel free to email me if you'd like them. This is how we can get the conversation going if the speaker doesn't know where to start. And if nothing stressful is present, I've added these questions here. What are you most excited about right now? What are you most looking forward to? What is something you've been meaning to tell me? And if you're getting kind of short responses, to keep the conversation going and to dig a little deeper, you can say, tell me more about that. Say more. What does this situation remind you of? What values or dreams are connected to this situation and experience for you? So here's where we kind of wrap up. Feel free to write down my email address. You can also find me on the KC Resolve page. These are some of the things that we talked about today. The Relationship Cure by John Gottman and Joan DeClaire is just a fantastic resource. If you're wanting to know what your emotional command system, your primary ones are, email me. I can email you that assessment. The Dreams Within Conflict and the Stress Reducing Conversation is also something I can get to you. Feel free to visit Resolve's page for tips on how to have the stress reducing conversation. That's up there on a blog that I've written as well. So this is where we switch to Q&A time.
Thank you so much, Christy. That was so good. You're so nice and calm, and the way you describe everything is so peaceful.
Thank you.
So, can I book an appointment with my husband and
Yes.
I go see you?
Actually, no. That would not be ethical.
Yeah, no, I'm just kidding. But you really did a great job kind of breaking like the steps down and just helping to like people to understand where conflict can become a problem. And it's not, I mean, it can be for lots of reasons, but I mean, I love what you said about the 7 emotional command centers. And I think understanding that can help. Well, obviously it's going to improve communication so much, but like, I mean, there's so many tools like the 5 love languages and all of these things that can help people communicate and like show they're loved and appreciated. And like, that is a perfect example of one of those tools. So why wouldn't we use those? I think that is so, so brilliant. I do a lot of couples counseling as well. And I kind of feel like from all the years that I've been doing it, it's like, there's 3 main points in terms of effective communication. And this isn't like written down anywhere specifically, but just in my head. And one is, it needs to be safe to communicate, right? If it doesn't feel safe to communicate, it won't happen, or it'll just shut down. And I think what you said in terms of the stress reduction and that whole process was like, just hit that nail on the head. The second one is the speaker needs to get what they need, right? So whether it's being heard or whatever, I think what you said in terms of like, don't side with enemy, all of those tips that you gave just totally fit into how to get the speaker's needs met. Because if I keep telling you the same thing over and over and over again, but yet you don't hear me, or the same thing happens over and over again, I'm going to stop telling you. So that's where communication starts breaking down. And I think the third one was the key element for effective communication is there needs to be resolution or solution.
Yeah.
And I think what you said in terms of the dreams within conflict, like, boom, that just totally hit it on the head. Like, right? So I just really love this presentation. I think the information you gave us was super helpful. I love that you touched base on the vicarious trauma. We've heard of that a lot today, which is really interesting. Dreams and goals. I like how you said too, is that sometimes we have to switch the goal. Right. So like if you're running into the same conflict over and over and over again, maybe the goal is the thing that needs to be changed. Right. Because we know with personality types and with, like you just said, these 7 emotional command centers, that's not something that's likely going to change. So really, really good. So some of the questions, one of them was really clearly answered. My partner struggles to communicate with me. How do we overcome this? So like, how do we approach our partner with, I'm really struggling to communicate with you, or maybe we need some counseling support. How would you advise someone to speak to their partner to kind of seek and get that support that they might need?
I would Google The Gentle Startup by John Gottman.
Okay.
It's got 6 skills and a very clear formula on how to invite the person into meet your need. Invite the person into having a conversation, because what he discovered is that 94% of the times the way a conversation started with couples is how it ended. Okay. So if we start with criticism, if we start with blaming, then it's going to end up with more of the same. Okay. But if we soften our startup and we posture ourselves like this, then it's going to give them an opportunity to step closer to us.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah.
Okay. That's a really good tip. Another question that that's come through is I've always struggled with interpersonal relationships. What should I do?
Well, that's a tricky one for me because I feel like I need to know this person more. I need more information. Yeah. I would say, get with a therapist and explore what that might be. I think The Relationship Cure was a game changer for me. That book, The Relationship Cure, was a game changer for me because there was just a slew of self-assessments that brought in that awareness. And it also talks a lot about the power of responding to emotional bids. So what John Gottman found, what makes love last, is not necessarily healthy communication, but it's avoiding the 4 horsemen, which we didn't have time to go in today, and building a friendship. And by building a friendship, what he means is acknowledging when somebody makes an emotional bid and doing your best to respond at least 86% of the time. Okay. And that's also what creates emotional safety, what you were talking about. So if I know that when I bid to my partner that I get a 5-to-1 ratio from him of he's going to respond. He's going to say, if I come home and I go, and he doesn't say anything, then, that's a missed opportunity for us to have connection. Now, if he says, oh goodness, what happened today? Tell me what's going on. He's responded to that emotional bid. So they can be verbal, they can be nonverbal, they can be touch, they can be non-touch, they can be flirtatious, they can be mundane. So understanding, and I wrote a blog on this too. Okay. So it's a small change that can have a big impact on your relationship. It talks about how to know what an emotional bid is and the 3 different ways we can respond. And so by responding to people's coworkers, family members, partners' emotional bids is going to increase that friendship and increase that safety and increase that affection.
Wow. Okay. Gosh. You know your stuff, girl. That's great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Lovely, lovely. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think
so. Christy's information, her bio, her details, her email address is all on the Casey Resolve website. It's also on the CARE4U2. Her bio is on the CARE4U2 tab on the Casey Resolve website as well. All right. So we're going to close now. This is the end of our 3-day virtual conference, and man, it has been an adventure, that's for sure. Thank you all so much for taking your time for yourself today. I hope that you found connection between your mind, body, and spirit throughout the past 3 days. The work that we do and the lives that we live require us to care for ourselves too. We hope that you're able to use this virtual self-care conference as a valuable resource. As a reminder, you can access conference videos categorized by day from our website, KC /CARE4U2.com. Resolve Counseling and Wellness would like to thank the participants, the presenters, and our sponsors for this amazing opportunity to connect to you and our community. Resolve is here to support you and the Kansas City community with any mental health needs. Thanks again for attending our 4th annual CARE4U2 conference. We hope you leave today feeling you've connected and cared for your mind, body, and spirit.